Hello, I'm Dr. Lisa Colledge. I'm the CEO and founder of Lisa Colledge Consulting, and I work with organizations to design their culture, to make that culture enabling of all the different thinking styles, cognitive styles that exist in the world. And that in turn will make sure that your culture is the most engaging, innovative, and resilient culture possible. I base all of that on the principles of neurodivergence inclusion. In this episode of Culture by Neurodesign, I want to look at the trend, which is often talked about these days, the trend to disengage from DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, from the point of view of, can't I just dump it all on ERGs, right? The title of this episode of my podcast is, Can't I Rely on ERGs to Drive DEI? So let me start by explaining what I mean by an ERG, or an employee resource group. Right? Sometimes they're called employee networks, maybe there are other names as well, but I always call them ERGs because that was a terminology used in the company where I led an ERG. My experience is about leading a disability inclusion ERG called Enabled, and specifically focusing on neurodivergence inclusion, but in this podcast I'm going to talk about ERGs in general. So ERGs are focused on a diversity of dimension, and the most common ones are age, disability, often phrased as ability to be more empowering, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. Sometimes I combined with something else like women in technology, but they tend to be the ones that you'll find in most organizations. So the structure of the ERGs is pretty complex. In international companies, I have still to find an exception to this. You not only have ERGs working separately on the different dimensions, but you often have chapters of each particular dimension in each country or perhaps region that the organization operates in, so it's quite complicated. And these ERGs spring up because people want to feel part of a community in the organization that they work in. They place a high value on connecting with people with similar lived experiences to them. Perhaps they feel lost, perhaps they feel disconnected, perhaps they feel scared. In that situation, an ERG is incredibly useful to provide support, to provide comfort, to provide sanity, as I found and I've talked about, and also to provide inspiration about how you can proceed. I have a really high regard for ERG members and ERG leaders. I talked about this in episode 3, especially because ERGs are led by volunteers. So most companies make a small proportion of time available. It's usually 10%. Usually, unfortunately, without any reduction in scope of the day job of that person, and 10% really isn't enough to get much done, is it? It's half a day of somebody working full time. So people tend to use an awful lot of their spare time to get things done in the ERGs. The other sad thing is that contributions to the ERG success are usually also not included in the annual performance evaluation discussions. It's really a separate thing to that. Okay, so in this episode, I'm asking whether it's okay for you as a leader to just rely on your ERGs to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, in your organization. And the short answer is no, don't do it. It's a really common approach, but as a leader, you should not delegate accountability and responsibility to ERGs to drive DEI in your organization. It's really unfair, and you're going to miss out on opportunities to make your organizational outcomes better. That's a short answer. I'm going to spend the rest of this podcast, explaining why that is my answer. So if ERGs are in the lead for DEI initiatives in your organization, as opposed to leadership being in the lead, then yes, you will see some progress in parts of your organization. But the first problem is that it's patchy. It's patchy progress. You're passionate, knowledgeable ERG volunteers will of course use their personal connections to make progress on the diversity dimension that they care about, but this won't be consistent over the company. All right, it's fragmented not only by the fact that they use their personal connections, but also by the fact that they're working in one diversity dimension, not across all of them. And remember that geographical complexity that I mentioned as well, with different chapters of each ERG existing in different countries and regions. Of course, it's possible for the ERGs, in theory possible. It's possible for them to coordinate, but in practice, that would take all of the 10% of time that they have available. And the chance that every ERG lead in every country and every dimension has capacity at the same time to lead a DEI initiative is vanishingly small. I suppose in theory it's possible, but I don't think it's ever really going to happen. That localization, that fragmentation, you need it when you think about DEIs as communities, recognizable communities which share experiences of somebody who wants to connect. But it is not suitable to lead a DEI initiative for a whole organization. Then you need a unified effort. So patchiness is the first problem. The second problem is that it's not sustainable. So as soon as the person or the ERG who is driving the change in the group where they are personally connected, as soon as they focus somewhere else, or as soon as they move to a different role, or as soon as the manager of the team who was initially very supportive, as soon as that manager leaves to work somewhere else, all of those changes will drop pretty quickly. There's another reason as well, which amplifies that observation that I've made about this not being sustainable. And it's quite often the case that ERG leads, the people who volunteer, are quite junior and early on in their career. Through no fault of their own, they're inexperienced in working with leadership, especially with C-suite people. Now, I really admire those junior people for stepping up, don't get me wrong. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity for them to gain experience of leading and of working at a higher level. The trouble with it being a volunteer role is that these people are rarely managed or coached. In my experience, never. I'm sure there's an exception, but I've never found it yet. They're never managed or coached in how to lead the ERG, in how to position things to their leadership, in how to engage with the C-suite, because this is not their role. Sometimes it's an executive sponsor, but the role of the executive sponsor is not to manage or coach the ERG lead. So what you see then is the ERG leads tend to tell teams that they work with what the solution is that they must put in place. And that solution often reflects their personal experience, their personal situation, what will work for them. Trouble is, the solution that we're after is never usually one size fits all. If I think about the area in particular of disability, into which neurodivergence falls, the focus is very often in having a formal process in place to request accommodations. And if that's in place, then the inclusion initiative will be considered successful. But the trouble is that's also unsustainable. You're working one person at a time, and it can also emphasize the otherness of people and build stigma, which is exactly what we want to reduce, eliminate, right? Don't get me wrong, accommodations are a part of the solution, but they're not the solution. They're a small part of the solution. And the third problem, why it is a challenge if ERGs are leading DEI initiatives, is that it does not promote wellness, right? So imagine you've got these DEI leads. They've become, ERG leads. They've become ERG leads because they feel a personal compulsion, a personal connection to that particular diversity dimension, and they want to make a difference for people in a similar situation and in their region of the world. They're trying hard. They want to change. They're going to get really frustrated when change does not happen. And I've seen it multiple times. They get disillusioned, right? The literature says that globally, across all industries and all sizes of organizations, 11% of employees are actively disengaged. That means vocally negative and dragging other people down with them, right? They are actively engaged. And there's also a high chance when your ERG leads become actively disengaged that they will burn out. And you can imagine why. It's not that difficult to imagine the path. You can also imagine the reputational hit to your company from employees seeing these formerly very passionate, very motivated people burn out, and especially when they hear their perspective of the reason that they're burning out. That's not going to be motivating for anyone. All right, so that's the reasons why ERGs should not lead DEI initiatives. So why is leadership needed? What is the reason? So one reason is methodological, right? The issues that you're trying to tackle when we work in DEI are systemic. A new culture, a new inclusive culture means, first of all, that everybody has to be doing it, or just about everybody, a few exceptions, but that's okay. Just about everybody needs to be doing it. They need to share certain principles in how they behave and operate in your organization. And the second is that it needs to be sustainable. That is what makes a new culture a culture. If it's not sustainable, it's just a passing trend, right? It has to be sustainable. If we look at the cultural change initiatives that work, they all have some things in common. Leadership, one of the things in common is that leadership has to model the behavior that they want. They have to set the example. You also have to involve your employees in testing it, in identifying and eliminating unconscious biases, and in translating that particular culture to the situation of their team. All right, so leadership has to be involved for that condition to be possible. The second thing that cultural change initiatives at work have in common is that they're sustainable because you reinforce the behavior that you want in your operational processes, in your hiring, in your promotion, in your performance evaluation, and in your policies. And obviously you also need leadership engaged to make those changes in the very fabric of your organization. Now, I talked a while ago when I was talking about why ERG leads shouldn't be driving DEI initiatives. I talked about the shortcomings of telling teams that this is a solution, often based on personal experience. There's actually a model for sustainable cultural change, and that's called freedom within a framework. And if you work with me, this is what I will work with you to put in place. So what this means is that leadership defines and exemplifies a non-negotiable framework. And that framework outlines the characteristics of the culture that you want and the goals of the culture that you want. Now, of course, you're going to set that, by discussing what it should be with your employees as well. But once that's set, that is set and it's not negotiable. That's a framework. And within that framework, you give employees at all levels the training, and you give them the accountability to implement inclusive practices in the teams that they work in, so that framework is true. That's why it's called freedom within a framework. So this approach is an engaging approach. It makes sure that the framework that you've defined is always put in place in a way that's relevant to a particular team. It means that it's adaptable to change which may occur internally, like changes in the composition of talent in your teams. And it also means that it's resilient to external changes, right? Like ChatGPT coming onto the market, for example. Also, in a dimension like disability, it means that there will be a vastly reduced need for individual accommodations. A few, but really vastly reduced need. So that approach, that methodological approach of freedom in a framework, is one reason why leadership needs to drive DEI initiatives. And as well as a methodology, there's a second reason, right? And I talked about this much more in episode 7, so listen to that if you want to learn more. But the reason is that when you do a DEI initiative as a leader, you should be doing it as a way to optimize value for your organization. It's not enough to do it for the sake of it, and I think for an organization it's not enough to do it only because it's the right thing to do. That's the job of society. As an organization, with employees, with customers, with maybe owners and stakeholders, you also have a duty to have an eye on the bigger outcome, right? And to make sure that anything that you invest in as a leader like this is optimizing the outcomes. The work that I will do with you will emphasize innovation and resilience as one of the key outcomes, and also talent management, whether that's in acquisition of talent, retention of talent, engagement of talent. ERG leads will not be looking at these bigger opportunities for your organization. They are driven, quite understandably and quite rightly, by personal motivations, right? They are not driven, and they also don't have the role to make your organization better for your customers and stakeholders. So that's the second reason why leadership needs to lead in this area. And this is not just my opinion. It's always always nice to have your opinion validated, and my opinion is validated by research by McKinsey. Research shows that when you have a higher level of diversity in your organization, you increase the chance of strong performance, but you're only actually going to get that strong performance and the improved outcomes when leadership is driving your DEI initiative and they take bold action, right? So those are the conditions. Okay, I hope that you have understood, as I've been talking so far, what a high regard I do have for ERG members and ERG leaders. And although I've said that they shouldn't be leading, in my opinion, DEI initiatives, I do think that they have an important role to play in DEI initiatives. They certainly also have an important role to play in your organization, right? And let me talk about my personal experience first as a member of an ERG. I'll talk quite quickly as a member of an ERG, and then as a leader, to explain to you what I think the importance of ERGs is in DEI initiatives. So a few years ago, when I found out that my son's autistic with learning difficulties, I eventually joined an ERG called Enabled. It's a disability inclusion ERG. I ended up leading that, but whether I was a member or a leader, I was really warmed and supported by the huge generosity and, quite frankly, bravery of members who shared their experiences, their vulnerability with me, with great compassion and with great humour. It was a really motivated, energetic, knowledgeable group of people, and it made a massive difference. It kept me going. It gave me the energy and the confidence to keep going in that difficult situation and to keep contributing to the organization's success. So that kind of experience, that kind of passion is incredibly valuable to the kind of top-down initiative that I'm saying leadership should lead. The top-down DEI initiative that leadership should lead. The ERG passion is incredibly valuable if you can create a safe environment where people want to share that passion. You're basically asking them to be champions for inclusion. And why is it valuable? First of all, is that the people can show that what you're doing with your top-down initiative is really relevant, right? They can talk to you to help you to learn, they can motivate you to start, and they can also motivate their peers to understand the extent of the problem, the extent of the opportunity, perhaps to recognize a challenge that they hadn't appreciated or understood. This motivation is really, really important to start any kind of change initiative. Everybody needs to be involved, and everybody needs to stay involved, because you're talking about something which will take a couple of years or a few years. So relevance and motivation, that's one. A second really important role of ERGs is that they can educate, right? They have a lot of knowledge. Believe me, they've done a lot of reading about this area, and they have a lot of knowledge from personal communication as well. So they can educate you as leadership about the current status and the current opportunities. They can educate their teammates, and they can suggest solutions that teams, as part of that freedom within the framework, they can suggest solutions that teams can consider to adopt. So they're not going to tell them to adopt it, but maybe they're going to give them a short list of things that they can select the most relevant for them. And the third reason that ERGs definitely have a role to play in DEI initiatives is that they can inspire as well. If you give people a platform to share their stories, negative stories, positive stories, that can really inspire people, and it's another way to help keep a change initiative on track. So what I just said about ERGs showing the relevance, educating and inspiring people to participate and stay the course of a top-down led DEI initiative, that's based on my experience. And based on extensive discussions with ERG leads all around the world. But you've heard me say earlier in this episode, it's nice to validate. And I want to share with you quickly the top 10 priorities that have been identified by leads of disability inclusion ERGs all around the world. This is my summary of a report which is produced by the organization Purple Space, a fantastic organization which helps disability inclusion ERG leads to be successful. So first of all, what you can see from the top 10 priorities is that ERG leads are saying, include us. We want to be included. We don't want you to do this without us. The priorities that they are calling out in this area are that they want to share stories to normalize disability. They want leadership to structurally listen to your employees and customers who have disabilities and understand the challenges. They want to make sure that you consider the needs of disability in achieving your strategic priorities. They're asking you to let us contribute. Sometimes you might need accommodations, but let us contribute, enable us to contribute. And they're asking you to invest in them as employees as much as you invest in line managers, in building the disability confidence of line managers. So ERG leads all around the world want to be included in DEI initiatives. They want to participate, not only be included and informed, but they actually want to participate. So they're saying, invest in this ERG. Invest in this ERG. Give us some time, give us some resource, but invest in us. Let us be a part of your environmental, social, and governance strategy, ESG strategy. And let's get going. Don't wait for perfect data. Let us participate. Let us contribute. And finally, I'd group the last two priorities in terms of be proud of us. Right? Celebrate what we are contributing as employees who are maybe different to the typical employee that you may have in mind, and also call out our contributions on an external website, so you're externally showing your support for us and your support for our ERG. So definitely ERGs want to be involved, but please notice that none of those priorities that I just ran through that are published in that report say, let us lead DEI initiatives for the company. It's about supporting, it's about contributing, it's about sanity checking. It is not about leading. So in summary, no, you cannot just leave your DEI initiatives to your ERGs and give them token support, 10% of time and a bit of budget. No, you as leaders need to take accountability and responsibility for your DEI initiatives. ERGs certainly need a formal role in any DEI initiatives, but as a valued stakeholder, right? They should not be accountable for driving it, and they should not be responsible for doing all the work. They do some of it, but not all of it. But they should be a valued stakeholder. Leadership needs to be accountable for the DEI initiatives and to lead them. If you do that, you will get to the situation which I think is really nicely summed up by this quote from Richard Branson, who's, of course, the CEO of the Virgin Group. And this is a quote that I'll leave you with. So Richard says, when diversity and inclusion becomes part of your DNA, it also becomes a major driver of success.